first, why does this even matter? Well, as I'm sure everyone here is aware, randomness is a key part of just about every game to some extent, especially board games and tabletop role-playing games. The exact mechanics of that randomness affects the way your game feels in the hands of the players. Even if it's a digital game, stuff like Fallout and XCOM all have, somewhat visible probability elements in their games. And even if you're not directly translating these mechanics into your games, you can still use the randomness and the probability curves from these mechanics hard programmed into a digital game to simulate the same kind of feel. So even if you're not a board game or tabletop person, the stuff we're going over here can still be applied to your games. So what are we going to do? First, we're going to make a very simple core mechanic for a game. We're going to talk about the math behind certain dice mechanics. We're going to compare and contrast those mechanics with some systems from published games, particularly tabletop RPGs. And yeah, it'll be kind of fun. It'll be a bit of an adventure, kind of a Willy Wonka or Dante's Inferno thing, depending on how much you like math. We're going to start with the simpler stuff, get to the scary stuff, and then work our way back to the simpler stuff. All right, real quick, I wanted to do an overview about what tabletop role-playing is. This is my main background in game design. Tabletop role-playing games are story games. Usually there's 2 to 7 players. One of them is the game master who controls the world, the supporting characters, and stuff like that. Everyone else controls a character in the story, usually a character that they create themselves. A lot of video games are based on tabletop RPG mechanics, and not just the role-playing games. Strategy games also draw heavily from this same kind of thing. MOBAs are pulling in a lot of RPG mechanics too. So tabletop games can be any genre and any level of complexity. There are one-page RPGs like Honey Heist or Lasers and Feelings, and then there are massive books like Exalted, which is literally the size of your high school biology textbook. So, again, starting small, the most important part of a game is its core mechanic. The core mechanic of board games and tabletop games usually is rolling dice. We're going to be basing our system on an extremely simple one-page RPG called Lasers and Feelings. The way this game works, you only have one stat. Pick a number between 2 and 5. That's it. When your character does something using lasers, which is science, logic, or precision, you want to roll below the number you picked. When you want to use feelings, which is emotion, passion, or creativity, you roll above that number instead. If you get that number exactly, you get what the game calls laser feelings, where you succeed and you can ask the GM a question about the world or the plot or the setting or a character. Let's take a look at the math behind this real quick. If you picked a lower number, your character is going to be better at feelings because you're more likely to roll a higher result. If you picked lasers, then you probably wanted a higher number. The odds of getting laser feelings, no matter what number you picked, are always going to be 1 in 6. So if you picked a 2 or a 5, you have a more specialized character. If you picked a 3 or a 4, your character is a bit more versatile, but less consistently good at things. So if you look at the chart here, you can see the kind of probability you're looking at with your 6-sided die roll and your number. And that's cool, but what if we wanted our game to have more than 2 stats? Well, here we go. So for our system, let's actually add a 3rd stat in. We're going to rename lasers to blue. We're going to rename feelings to red, and we're going to add green, a 3rd stat, which will represent calm and empathy and de-escalation. To generate your stats, the total of all of your stats has to be 7, and every stat has to be at least 1. Just like in lasers and feelings, when you roll a check, you're rolling a single 6-sided die, and you need to get less than or equal to your stat. With this really basic system, we can actually get a couple of different combinations. If you go 1-1-5, there's one stat your character is extremely good at, but you're total garbage at the other 2. If we go 1, 2, 4, you're a little bit more well-rounded, but you still have a specialty. 1, 3, 3, your character has 2 specialties. If you go 2, 2, 3, then your character can be a little good at everything, but only really exceed in one area, and even then, only some of the time. This is a pattern you actually see a lot in role-playing games. Typically, specialization is better than generalization because you're playing with a group. If one character can be good at everything, what's the point of the other players being there? So this is a perfectly playable, extremely simple RPG system, but I think we can go a little bigger with this. Let's talk about Call of Cthulhu. So Call of Cthulhu is a percentile dice system. The way it works is you roll 2 10-sided dice instead of 1 6-sided die. One of these 10-sided die is the tens digit, the other one is the ones digit. As a result, you can get a result between 1 and 100. Your character has an entire list of skills, which are all rated between 20 and 75. Just like lasers and feelings, you have to get less than or equal to the skill in order to succeed on a roll. Here's why this mechanic works for Call of Cthulhu in particular. You always know exactly what your chances of success are. When you look at your character sheet and say, I only have a 30% chance of pulling this off, it makes you a lot more hesitant to try doing that thing. As a result, your characters tend to be less willing to take risks in the system. Second, Call of Cthulhu is a horror game. As you play the game, your skills are actually reduced, not improved. So already there's an idea in the player's head that rolling lower is rolling safer. Lower numbers are always going to be safe in this system. My game, Lightning War, is actually also a kind of similar roll below system, except the way this one works is the die you're rolling changes based on the difficulty of the task. For example, you'd roll a d6 for an easy thing or a d12 for a hard thing. This means if your stat's high enough, you can automatically succeed on certain tasks. It also means characters always have some chance of succeeding. This is good because while it keeps a similar kind of desperate tone to Call of Cthulhu, it still makes characters feel competent and effective. Now, cosmic horror or gritty wargame probably wasn't exactly what you had in mind for your RPG. And while percentile dice can work for suspenseful games like Call of Cthulhu, what if we want our players to be reckless? What if we want action and adventure in our game? Maybe Dungeons or Dragons. Someone had to have made a game like that, right? Well, turns out they did. Real quick, the artist of this Redbox box set thing, Larry Elmore, actually just did a panel at 5. I don't know if anyone here was able to make it to that, but I got to see one at an earlier siege and it was incredibly cool. Now, back to the dice mechanics. D&D is a target number based system. The way it works is you roll a 20-sided die, add a modifier, and compare the total to a target number. For example, you roll 1d20 plus 5 to attack. The enemy's armor means you need a total of 16 or higher to hit. Since you have a plus 5 bonus, that means you need an 11 or higher on the die in order to hit the enemy. So adding a modifier to your roll does some kind of interesting stuff to the math. It increases the maximum result you can generate, but it also raises the minimum result. So the odds of rolling that result actually don't change. If you look at the graph here, the orange line shows a regular 20-sided die's probability of rolling at least the number you need. If you add a plus 5 modifier to that, it doesn't actually change the shape of the line. It just moves where it is on the graph. You're not changing the odds of rolling an 11. You're just increasing the minimum and maximum roll that's possible. In D&D, this can actually lead to some weird edge cases where extremely high-level characters actually can't get hit by lower-level monsters. The monsters just can't roll high enough to hit you because your bonuses are too high. So, again, this is what I like to call a target number system. Target numbers are useful because the game master can make the difficulty of a roll independent from the character's stats. In Call of Cthulhu or Lasers and Feelings, you always know what you need to roll in order to succeed. In D&D and target number-based systems, that number is uncertain. A couple of other systems have done some interesting twists on this. For example, Cyberpunk Red, the tabletop game that inspired Cyberpunk 2077, you roll a 10-sided die instead of a 20-sided die. Since there's a narrower range of random numbers, the dice roll isn't as important as the bonus your character adds to it. Your stats become more important than the randomness. There's also a game system called Savage Worlds, where the size of the die you roll is based on how skilled your character is. Characters with little to no experience only roll a 4-sided die, while experts will roll a 12-sided die. This has some really cool math to it, but it means that some tasks may actually be too difficult for your character to ever succeed. That's not necessarily a bad thing, it's just a design choice. Now, if we look at this graph, it got a weird curve in there. How exactly did that happen? So 5th edition D&D added a new mechanic. Instead of using modifiers, which raise the maximum and minimum, they decided to give you the ability to roll twice and take either the higher or lower result. Once you start rolling multiple dice, it messes with the probability of rolling certain numbers, but it doesn't increase the range of results. So if we look at the table, when you roll a 20-sided die twice and take the lower result, the minimum and maximum you can roll is still 1 in 20, but it bends the average away from rolling higher. If you're rolling twice and taking the higher result, it does the opposite. You're more likely to get a higher result, but it's not a huge difference. As you can see, the graph is still pretty narrow. And that brings us to rerolls. So mathematically speaking, a reroll is almost the same as rolling multiple dice and only choosing one of them. The main difference is whether or not the player has to use the second result or can choose either result. Mechanically, rerolls and roll and keep systems have very different feels. Roll and keep feels proactive. Generally, it's a reward for having a special ability or setting something up, like a combo with a teammate. Okay, this enemy is going to be really hard to hit. Let me move here and get advantage from double teaming him with your character. On the other hand, rerolls are more of like an in case of emergency kind of thing. Since players know what they rolled before they decide to use a reroll, it means they can't actually waste those abilities, but it also means they're tempted to save it for emergencies. It's the kind of, oh man, I rolled a 1. I'm going to burn one of my rerolls and not do that. So Risk is another game that uses a roll and keep kind of system. Pretty much in Risk, attackers can roll up to 3 dice, defenders can only roll 2. But whether you're attacking or defending, you only take the highest die roll. Since defenders win ties in Risk, this actually skews the odds slightly in their favor. If we wanted to use roll and keep in our game, the advantage of it, mainly, is that it doesn't affect the range of results like adding a flat modifier would. But roll and keep is still random. In Risk, yeah, you're rolling more dice than the other person, but what if you roll 3 1s? It can still happen. So let's go back to our game. So let's rename our stats body, mind, and spirit. It's a classic trio. It doesn't really affect gameplay. It's just a little bit more clear for the player. The total of your stats still has to be 8, but now we're adding some different rules about how you can set them. They can be as low as 0, but you can't make them higher than 4. When you roll a check, we're going to roll a 12-sided die and add one of our stats to the result. And we'll borrow D&D's advantage and disadvantage system. So if there's stuff working in your favor, you can roll the 12-sided die twice and take the higher result. Except, what if instead of a 12-sided die, we use 2 6-sided dice? If you look at this crazy graph here, the light blue line is a 12-sided die, and it's completely flat. You're just as likely to roll a 3 as you are to roll an 11. If we switch that to two six-sided dice, we get the gray line, this pyramid right there in the middle. Suddenly, a 7 becomes way more statistically likely than any other result, while the chances of rolling a 2 or a 12 are extremely low. So that's interesting, but what if we push this a little further? What if instead of two six-sided dice, we rolled three four-sided dice? It still is a maximum of 12, right? Well, if we do that, we get this orange line here, and we end up with a bell curve. You're more likely to roll a 7 or an 8 than anything else, and less likely to get anything closer to one of the extremes. What if we tried something even crazier, like a mix of dice, like an 8-sided die and a 4-sided die? That's when you get some really interesting stuff going on. Look at this dark blue line here. This is a truncated pyramid where the chances of getting a 4 or a 9 or anything in between are all the same, but the chances of getting higher or lower than that are less and less likely. So there's still a random range in the middle, but extreme cases are rarer. You can do some really cool kind of stuff with that. But introducing multiple dice into our game brings us to another example, Apocalypse World. So Apocalypse World is an example of a system that decided to use 2 dice instead of just 1 and total the results. Apocalypse World also did an interesting thing. They said, okay, if you roll a 10 or higher, it's a flawless success. If you roll a 7 to 9, you succeed with a complication. 6 or less is a failure. As we just saw in the previous slide, 2 6-sided dice means the most common result you're going to get is a 7, which means if your character doesn't have a bonus on that roll, you're more likely than not to get success with a complication. And Apocalypse World uses this as part of its core story. Except up until this point, we haven't talked about games with degrees of success in them. What does that mean? Let's get a little more into that. So degrees of success are a way to add some more variety to your game. In your games, success doesn't have to be binary. Sometimes the players can succeed at a cost. Sometimes they can fail, but mitigate it. Let's take another look at some of the systems we were already looking at. In a roll below system, like the very first one we were working on, what if rolling less than or equal to half your stat rounded down gave you some kind of critical success? That would be a way to add degrees of success into that kind of system. In a target number system, we could add something like a critical hit. If you roll the highest number on a die, it's a special success. Alternatively, some systems, Pathfinder 2nd edition, for example, say if you beat the target number by 10 or more, you get a critical hit. But if you miss it by 10 or more, you also get a critical failure. So those are some ways you can add degrees of success into simpler dice mechanics. But what if you wanted to actually go even more complicated with it? That brings us to dice pool systems. So Shadowrun is an example of this. In Shadowrun, you roll a fistful of 6-sided dice. Any dice that roll a 5 or higher are called a hit. If more than half the dice in your pool roll 1s, that's called a glitch and results in a critical failure. For example, if your character has 3 logic and 2 hacking, you'd roll 5 dice. The difficulty of a check tells you how many hits you needed to succeed. For example, a really tricky hack might require 3 or more successes. Well, what does that math look like? So the way dice pools work is on a bell curve, like we saw a couple slides ago. What that means is the more dice you roll, the more consistent your results are. Dice pools make characters feel powerful. For the players, rolling lots of dice feels really good. And the probability, almost guaranteeing their success, also feels really good because you're more likely to succeed. The flip side of dice pool systems is that smaller dice pools tend to struggle with the easiest tasks, while larger dice pools mathematically have almost no chance of failure. If we take a look at the graph over here, the light blue line is a 2d6 dice pool. If you look, you have just under a 60% chance of getting one success. If we double that and go to a 4d6 dice pool, your chances improve to about 80% likely to get one hit. If we double it again and use 8 six-sided dice in our pool, you're almost guaranteed to roll at least one success. Now, what about 3 hits? If you only have 2 dice in your dice pool, you mathematically cannot roll 3 hits. If you have 4 dice in your pool, your chances are still almost 0. And if you're rolling 8 dice, you only have about a 50% chance. But if you go up to 12 dice, suddenly you're still in the high 90s as far as chances of succeeding on that thing. So generally, as a very general rule for dice pool-based systems, you want to keep players between 3 and 10 dice in order to avoid those kinds of extreme cases. All right, so that last graph looked a little bit too much like something out of Call of Cthulhu. And I wouldn't be surprised if some people never want to talk about math or probability again after some of this. Maybe you're wondering, okay, maybe I can do something simpler for my game. The good news is you can. In fact, you don't even actually need dice. Yeah, so in 1985, an RPG called Amber Diceless RPG was published, and its main thing was that it didn't use dice. Instead, its mechanic was the character with the highest stat always wins. However, players could argue for circumstantial bonuses. So if your character is outmatched, you can use the environment or change the nature of the contest to force your opponent to use a different stat. If your opponent's stronger, but you're faster, instead of a straight fight, you could turn it into a chase scene, and as a result, get the advantage. Some other examples of systems with no dice at all are live-action role-playing games. So live-action role-playing games turn everything into either an entirely skill-based system or an entirely number-based system. For example, in a LARP, if you want to hit the enemy with a sword, you have to physically be able to hit them with a foam sword. It doesn't matter what your stats are or how much damage that sword hit does. You, the player, have to be at least a little okay at sword fighting in order to make that work. In order to even this out, some LARP systems and some diceless tabletop RPG systems give players a pool of points which they can spend strategically on special abilities and stuff like that. The main advantages of skill-based systems is that since there is no randomness, characters are consistently good at the stuff they're supposed to be good at. The downside is that skill-based systems limit players based on their out-of-game abilities. Players who are especially creative or especially knowledgeable about the rules, or who just practice with your system more, are going to be way more likely to excel in your system than new players or casual players. And that might not necessarily be what you're going for. So let's go back to our game real quick. We're going to make a couple of tweaks. We're going to turn this into a diceless system now. So the way it works, your stats have a minimum of 1 again, but your stats still need to total up to 8. You automatically succeed on a check if the difficulty is less than or equal to your stat. But if the difficulty is higher than your stat, let's say you can burn 1 point from that stat to succeed automatically. Problem is, this permanently reduces your stat for the rest of that session, meaning you're less likely to succeed on those kinds of things in the future. As a result, we have a built-in kind of pacing mechanism for players, and we give them a resource to manage even though they're not rolling dice. This could also be a perfectly functional, perfectly fine one-page RPG. But maybe we do want some randomness, we just don't want to be using dice. One of my game design mentors, a guy named Craig Campbell, made Capers, a RPG that uses playing cards instead of dice. The way it works is you draw a number of cards based on your stats, kind of like a roll and keep system, and the highest card determines your success or failure. However, the suit of that card determines your degrees of success. Another RPG with a pretty innovative mechanic is a horror RPG called Dread. The way this works is there's a Jenga tower in the middle of the table, and the difficulty of the task tells you the number of blocks you have to remove from the Jenga tower. Anyone who's ever played Jenga knows how nerve-wracking that can be and how that could play into a horror RPG. If the tower collapses, your character dies. So cards and stuff, those could be cool, but what if we want dice, we just don't want numbers or math in our game? Well, there are a couple of systems that do that too. So Fate is an extremely lightweight RPG that uses dice with symbols on them. They're six-sided dice with 2 plus signs, 2 minus signs, and 2 blank faces. The plus signs and minus signs cancel each other out, and you succeed on a roll as long as you have more pluses than minuses at the end. Another system that uses this is Edge of the Empire, as well as a couple of Fantasy Flight Games' other role-playing games. These games use a dice pool of custom dice with symbols instead of numbers. Using symbols on dice can be extremely interesting because it gives you complete control over the math of your game. The main downside is that symbol dice require players to buy a set of dice exclusively for your game. If you're making a digital game, this actually isn't an issue. Not only can you program the dice to have as many of the symbols as you want, you can also program the dice to have as many sides as you want, giving you infinite control over the odds of success or failure for your game. I want to go into a little bit more detail about Edge of the Empire system, because it does a lot of interesting things. Just like with Fate, opposite symbols cancel each other out. However, Edge of the Empire uses a couple different levels of symbols. There's success and failure, and then there's also advantage and threat, which generate narrative consequences and are pretty much a resource the players and the GMs can spend in order to affect the story. Different dice have different numbers of symbols. For example, the triumph or despair symbols only show up on the yellow or red dice. And success and failure don't actually show up on the boost or setback dice. They only generate advantage or threat. So with a system like this, you can make an extremely intricate balance of symbols and do some really interesting things with the mechanics. It's just up to you how far you want to push that. So I've gone through a lot of stuff in this panel, so let me go ahead and do a bit of a recap for everyone. The simplest kind of dice system you can use in your game is a roll below system, something like Lasers and Feelings or Call of Cthulhu. In these systems, the player has a number they're trying to roll equal to or less than on a single die. There are no bonuses, no penalties, just a number. Target number systems make the difficulty of a roll independent from the player's stats. As a result, it adds a lot more uncertainty to the game and possibly a lot more excitement. The main example of this is going to be Dungeons and Dragons, but there are other systems that use this kind of thing too. Modifiers are a way for you to increase the player's chances of success by increasing the minimum and maximum results they can roll. However, that can be a double-edged sword in your game because it pushes numbers possibly out of the range of certain challenges. Rerolls and rolling keep systems can help or hinder your chances without affecting the range of results. As a result, those systems tend to be better for games with a very narrow range of numbers. Finally, dice pool systems involve rolling several dice and counting any that roll certain results. Games like Shadowrun use pools of regular dice. Edge of the Empire uses a pool of special symbol-based dice. If you're only rolling one die in your game, it is a flat probability curve. The odds of rolling a number are equal, no matter what number it is. Rolling 2 dice gives you a pyramid shape, where the average result is also the most common result. Or where the median result, my bad, is also the most common result. If you're rolling 2 different sized dice, it makes a truncated pyramid. There's a range of equally likely numbers in the middle, but extreme highs or lows are less likely. If your game uses 3 or more dice, the probability ends up looking like a bell curve. The numbers in the middle are significantly more likely than any of the extremes. Ultimately, the dice system you decide to use for your game has a massive impact on the tone and feel of that game. If it's less likely for your character to succeed, then it adds a sense of, that affects the atmosphere of the game. Just like in Call of Cthulhu, the odds of success are right there in front of you since it's a percentile dice system. Meanwhile, in a dice pool game like Shadowrun, the fact that your character is constantly succeeding makes you feel more powerful. Ultimately, the system you use is up to you. There isn't a right or wrong answer. No dice is also an option. So is cards. So are pools of points. So are Jenga towers. In fact, I've heard some interesting discussion about whether or not you could make a deck building game into a role-playing game. So you can also make special dice exclusive to your game. And that comes with its own set of unique opportunities and unique complications. Hopefully, though, the most important lesson you've gotten out of this is that there are a lot of games out there which have tried a lot of cool things. And the best way to learn about these systems, the feel they cultivate, and the benefits and drawbacks they have, is going to be to go out and try them. At least read the rule books, see what works, see what hasn't, and let that influence the design of your game. Thanks again for coming to the panel. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of Siege and then goes and plays some games afterwards. I'll be sticking around in Discord or here, maybe both, for a Q&A 15 minutes after this. If anyone has any questions about the presentation or questions about any of the games I mentioned, I'm going to be happy to answer them there. But again, thank you all for coming. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. And Abby, we can go ahead and open it up.
Also, as a quick reminder to everyone, we are recording this session, just as a heads up. But feel free to unmute as you have questions or comments.
That was a great info, Ben. Thank you.
Thank you.
And you answered my question. I put something in chat, but you answered it already.
Oh, okay. Awesome.
So there are so many systems. Which one is the best?
Oof. Well, that really depends on the game you're trying to make. Personally, I'm partial to just the straightforward simplicity of roll below systems, but that's my personal taste. A lot of people really like dice pools. A lot of people really like target numbers. It's just, it all comes down to what feels right for your game.
Ben, I have a question.
Sure.
You talked about the card game. I mean, the cards is an option where the number was sort of your difficulty range or your attempt to get over the difficulty. But then you said the suits represented a degree of success. Can you unpack that or explain that a little more?
Yeah. So in Capers, the way it works is, if your character's stat is a 3, you draw 3 cards and you take the highest. So let's say the highest you get is a 5 of diamonds. That means the number you air quotes rolled would be a 5. And the diamond, you check they have a table in the book. I can't remember it off the top of my head, but I believe diamond is succeeds with some kind of additional benefit. So if a 5 is high enough to succeed, not only do you succeed, there's some kind of extra benefit that comes from the attempt. And if it's not high enough to succeed, something good still comes out of the roll, even though you failed.
That's cool. Thank you.
No problem.
So I had a question about how that would feel as a player, Ben, which is,
okay.
I don't know if you've played Capers a lot. It sounds like you have, but what happens when you draw that card and the 5th card you drew was you already were able to beat it. Possibly you already drew a diamond, so you got success plus an extra bonus, and then you drew a spade, which is a higher numbered spade, which may be success with a penalty.
Right.
And so you're like, if only I had drawn fewer cards, I would be happier.
Yeah.
And do people end up in that situation ever?
Yeah. So so because it's roll and take the highest one, it's it's meant to have a little bit of, the reason it uses cards is because of that kind of poker or blackjack kind of feel. So it's the same kind of thing of as blackjack of like, oh no, I went over 21. It's I got a higher card, but it's a spade. So yes, that feeling can come up in the game, and that's part of the experience.
Okay.
Good evening. My name is John. I'm currently a master's student at Full Sail University working for game design.
All right,
And
awesome.
I have a question about kind of the aesthetic, the feels of some of the dice systems you mentioned here.
Okay.
I'm currently working on a tactics RPG very similar to like Fire Emblem. And we're trying to keep the dice system easy for the player. But we've seen a large swing in probability, as is wont with dice. The truncated pyramid that I was seeing with the mixed dice looks like it would really hone those skill checks in and make things smoother for the player. But I'm worried about it becoming overly complicated with them having to roll multiple dice types. You have any sort of opinion on that type of system?
Yeah, so it really just depends on how much other stuff you surround that mechanic with. If the only thing they're doing is rolling like a D8 and a D6, and there's not any, like, if that determines every aspect of the attack, like, you know, there isn't a separate damage roll or there isn't a follow-up roll to do something else. If it's just the one roll, I think there might be a little bit of a learning curve on it, but it would be fast and intuitive enough to resolve stuff quickly. It might take a little bit of getting used to, but as long as that's the only thing the player has to worry about when it comes to rolling, at least, like they aren't adding anything or doing anything too weird with it, it should be pretty fine.
All right, thank you.
No problem. All right, anyone else have any questions or anything? I know that was a lot of stuff to kind of blast through.
If nobody else
Actually,
go ahead.
oh, I was gonna say if no one else did, I was gonna ask you, but you go first.
I was just gonna say thank you for the talk. That was a lot of information. I pretty much screenshotted your entire presentation to save for notes.
Awesome. I'm glad you got something out of it.
I did want to ask if you have any other examples of card-based mechanics besides capers. I missed some of your talk there for a second. I had to step out.
Right. So off the top of my head, I know Malifaux, which is actually a tabletop war game, not a tabletop RPG, also uses a deck of cards. And at least one version of Deadlands, which is a Wild West RPG, uses poker hands in its magic system. The way the magic system works, based on my understanding of it, is you roll a check, and then based on the success of the check, that tells you how many cards you draw, and then you have to make the best poker hand you can out of it.
All right, thank you.
No problem. Hopefully that answers your question.
We also have a question in chat from Daedrin asking about getting playtesting for your system. What resources do you feel work best?
Oof. Playtesting is rough, honestly. The getting a group of playtesters together is, in my experience, that was the longest, slowest, and most painful part of making my own game. However, there is a lot of stuff you can actually do on your own. It's definitely not as fun or glamorous, but just rolling out combats in your own system or just rolling out the game. You can look at a spreadsheet all day, but until you're actually rolling the dice and going through the motions, there's a lot of stuff about the mechanics of your game you can figure out on your own before bringing in other players. one of the places I was able to get a good bit of playtesting was actually local conventions. Not so much the bigger shows like Dragon Con. I did have some success at MomoCon, but it's getting to be like a mini Dragon Con. But local gaming conventions, especially like the smaller the better when it comes to that kind of thing, but those can be really insightful pools of playtesters. I had a lot of, I didn't get a chance to try it out, but some people recommended just hunting for playtesters on Reddit. But if you have friends in the local gaming community or just a regular D&D group, taking a break from your weekly game and being like, hey, can you all help me playtest this is also a pretty easy way to get some feedback and some extra eyes on your game. Ultimately, the hardest part of the whole playtesting thing is finding other people to GM it. But especially if you have some friends in the local gaming community, you might be able to make that happen.
What's the most creative system you've seen?
Ooh, most creative system. So honestly, one system that I haven't gotten to play around with as much as I wished I could, that I really liked was actually the Green Ronin's Age system. It was originally designed for the Dragon Age tabletop RPG, but the way it works is you roll 3 6-sided dice. One of them is a different color from the other 2 dice. And that's called the stunt die or the dragon die, depending on the version of the system. So you roll the check, and if the stunt die matches either of the other 2 dice, you get a pool of stunt points you can spend on special stuff to enhance the roll, like a critical hit, or you get to take another action, or you can do a special flourish with your weapon, stuff like that. I really liked the idea of that system. I just haven't gotten to play enough of it.
I was wondering, could you explain a little more about the Edge of Empires, how they were putting in different types of dice to manipulate the rolls?
Yeah, okay. So in Edge of the Empire, the way it works is you have all the different colored dice. And so the way you put together your dice pool in Edge of the Empire is you have a ability score kind of thing and a skill. You roll a number of green dice equal to whichever one of those is higher. So like if your ability score is a 3 and your stats a 1, you would take 3 green dice. But then based on the lower one, you replace a number of those green dice with yellow dice. So if your stats a 3 and your skill's a 1, you would roll 1 yellow die and 2 green dice. Then, based on the difficulty of the situation, your GM would tell you how many purple or red dice to throw in there. And there might also be blue or black dice based on situational stuff. And that sounds a lot more complicated than it actually is in play, but that's how you would assemble the dice pool. And then after that, you roll it, you pair up symbols that cancel each other out and count whatever is left over. And that determines whether you succeed or fail.
Yeah, that sounds like it takes a lot of table time. I mean, in play, does that work quickly?
It actually, once players get the hang of the symbols, it actually does work pretty quickly. But the other thing is Edge of the Empire doesn't have like separate damage rolls or anything. You roll an attack, and the number of successes you generate on that attack determine how much damage you do. There isn't a separate roll for that. And that speeds things up a little bit.
It sounds a lot like Vampire the Masquerade in that regard.
Yeah, dice pool systems generally do take longer to resolve an individual roll, but because of the multiple successes and the degrees of successes, you actually get more information from that roll than you do just like a binary D&D, did you hit the number or not? Oh, I think I just saw a new
Yep.
thing in chat. All right, so connecting with consultants or getting guidance about ideating or scaling a game idea. So I don't have a lot of experience with consultants personally beyond just showing off my games at cons and looking for feedback. As far as scaling a game idea, I am the more time I play tabletop RPGs, the more interested I am in just keeping things as small and tight as possible. My game, Lightning War, the entire rule book is 88 pages, which is small by tabletop gaming standard, but still huge from a rule book standard. Like I said, Lasers and Feelings, that first game I mentioned, is a one-page role-playing game, and it is completely playable as a one-page game. So when it comes to scaling a game idea, my challenge would be make the absolute smallest, neatest, cleanest, most concise game you can, and then you always have room to add more stuff in later. But especially in tabletop RPGs, it can be easy to get carried away with player options and special abilities and all that kind of stuff. Just figure out the smallest number that your game actually needs and then build around that would be my advice.